Hello guys, in this video I'll be explaining to you how you can use the component library Mantine with Tailwind classes. The application I'm going to use as an example, it is running in a Node.js environment using Remix, or usually called React Router, as the full stack framework within an Express application. We are also using Vite as the build tool. The video will be split in a couple of sections. The first one, we will have the introduction, where we are going to quickly talk about the stack we are using and the problem we are facing. The second section, it's called How It Works. On this section, we will see how the setup was done and how to use the Tailwind with Mantine. And as the final section, I'm going to share with you a couple of tips that are considered really useful in terms of improving readability of a file. Regarding the tech stack we will be using, as I mentioned at the beginning, we have the front-end application running the Remix framework, as known as React Router. The problem we are facing with this setup when using Mantine as component library with Tailwind, it is that a couple of classes from the Tailwind get overridden by the Mantine classes. To show you an example, I have this testing project. I'm going to apply a couple of Tailwind classes on this welcome home title and see which ones will be applied and which ones would get overridden. As I mentioned, this is the title we are going to apply a couple of Tailwind classes. Let's apply a padding, change the font size, and apply a color on the text. And let's see how it behaves. The style I mentioned was applied. As you can see, we have a padding button of 10, which means 40 pixels, text yellow. This is using the default Tailwind color, and we are applying a font size of 14 pixels. Let's see how it looks on the browser. As you can see, a couple of styles were applied. The color, the spacing, but the font size looks off. If we inspect this title, you are going to see that all these styles are here, applied as classes, including the text size. But when you inspect the styles, you will see that the font size applied, it is the one from the Mantine. And the one we set from the Tailwind got overridden. And this is the main problem we face when using Tailwind with Mantine. The Mantine classes has priority when setting the styles on the element. And let's see why this is happening. To understand why this problem is happening, we need to understand how the setup with Tailwind was done. The Tailwind setup using Vite is pretty much simple. You can simply follow the documentation from their official website. So the first thing you have to do is to install the Tailwind CSS Vite library. Once this is installed, you have to import a couple of CSS files from Tailwind within your general CSS file. On my case, this is going to be app.css. Within the general CSS file of your application, if you check the Tailwind documentation, you will see that you can define a couple of layers and import a couple of CSS files. But on our case, it is really important that we do not import the pre-flight CSS. The reason for not importing the pre-flight CSS file, it is that this is one of the ways we have to set the pre-flight as false without using the tailwind.config.js file. And by doing this, we can avoid a couple of behaviors defined by the Tailwind that we want to avoid, because those can override the default behavior from Mantine library. Something else I did, I decided to define a couple of variable colors. So as you can see, my primary color is going to be a variance of this tone of blue. After defining that, you have to go to your vite.config.ts file, if you have this, and make sure you import the Tailwind CSS as one of the plugins of the application. And that should be enough to have Tailwind set up within your application. But after doing this, you saw that a couple of classes from Tailwind are getting overridden by Mantine classes. How do we fix that? The answer for this question is actually pretty simple, but I didn't find it easily by searching on the web. What we have to do now, it is to prioritize the Tailwind classes over the Mantine ones. And to do so, we can just simply add this flag. Since this is a CSS file. And as you can see, this is what happened. Now, our Tailwind classes are more important than the Mantine ones, which is nice. Now, knowing how the setup was done, and what we have to do in order to fix the problem with the classes getting overwritten, I'm going to show you how you can use Mantine with Tailwind. On our test application, we have a couple of sidebar menus. I'm going to go over each one and show you by using the Tailwind classes and not using Tailwind classes. By going to the table with dummy data, the first showcase I want to share with you, you can see that we have two tables. The first one was built not using Tailwind. This is using purely CSS align styles and Mantine component props. The second one was built using the Tailwind classes. As you can see, they are pretty similar. We have just a couple of changes, like the paddings. The sizings defined on the Tailwind classes are multiple of 4, and on this example we are using random values. And also a couple of colors. As you can see, the border, the one with Tailwind, it's a bit darker. This can be easily fixed. The next example will be form examples where we have a kind of form with a couple of inputs. And the same happens. We have a pretty close style, maybe with a couple of differences on colors or maybe spacings. Now talking about the pop-ups examples, we have same styles. Now drawers examples. And last but not least, a couple of buttons. The ones without Tailwind. The ones with Tailwind. We can reach the exact same style. If not, we can reach a really close one. Now, something I would like to do, it is to go over the code and show you how different those two components look in terms of code. On the left side, we have the table with Tailwind component. On the right side, we have the exact same component without Tailwind classes, using CSS inline and the Mantine props. The first thing I want to highlight, it is how we can decrease the code lines of a file. For example, on this case, we have reduced 14 code lines by only using the Tailwind classes instead of using the CSS inline. Now let's see how it looks. You agree that the one on the left side, it is way more readable than this one, right? Also, this one on the right side is not using a couple of good practices, such as not using color variables or even sizings. Now let's see how it looks with the buttons. On the left side, we have buttons built with Tailwind. On the right side, buttons without Tailwind. Now let's check how many code lines difference we have. The one on the left side, it is using the Tailwind classes. The one on the right side is not using the Tailwind classes. Depending on your use case, look how many code lines you can reduce. This is a difference of 146 lines. Okay, I think with it I can convince you that using the Tailwind classes, it is maybe the best way to build your components. Let's now dive into the tips and the suggestions I would give you when using Tailwind classes. On the first topic, I wanted to quickly talk about the cn utility function. It's pretty common that people, when using Tailwind classes, they use an aux function called cn to structure better or handle if statements when applying styles. Let me show you how readable this can become. To understand a bit better how you can use the cn auxiliary function, let's check this example right here. As you can see, a couple of default styles were defined. This function can receive infinity params. The params can be string or even objects. On this case, we have set a couple of classes, and I want to set some other classes based on a verification on an if statement. As you can see right here, if we have an odd row or an even row, we want to dynamically set the background color. But not only, if the row is selected, we want to apply the background yellow. This is perfectly doable with the cn function. If you do not use it, you would need to interpolate a string. and do something similar to it. We both agree this is awful. On this table TD, you can see that we can also have an object as one of the parameters for the C and auxiliary function. And doing like this, you can set a couple of classes if the condition you pass is true. Let's now go to the last topic, which is good practices. If we are building an application, it's really important that using Tailwind, we respect all the classes they have defined. So as you can see, we have 12 pixels, 14 pixels, 16 pixels, and so on as example of font sizings. It means we should avoid using 15 pixels or even 17 pixels. As you can see right here, one of the variables that Tailwind has, it is a spacing defined to 4 pixels. It's really important to understand that all the sizings usually are a multiple of 4. It means you should avoid applying 5 pixels in a bottom margin, because this is not the default value for the margins. Something else you need to be aware, it is that whenever we are using colors or hexadecimal colors, it's really important that we set all of them in variables because we can reuse it across the app. So it means never do something like this. Instead of doing this, if you want to set up a color that are not one of the variables we have defined on the app.css file, then create a new one for this, but never use hexadecimal color in the component. The same applies for the margin or any other measurement you use. So for example, if you want to apply a margin button of 4, it means 16 pixels. If you want to set it to 15, and this is something really recurring, do not do something like this, but actually create a new value for that, so you can use it like this. I'm okay when you want to use some specific width or height for a couple of components. So it's fine if you do something like this. 300 pixels is not one of the default values that Tailwind exports to us. So it's fine if you use something like this for width or height. But really try to use the default values it has. For example, the closest option we have to 300 pixels is 72, which means 288 pixels. But if you need to have it with 300 pixels, then do it in a hard-coded way, since it's very specific to your use case. And this is it. If you respect all the good practices I mentioned and all the suggestions I gave, we are going to have a pretty solid code base and a pretty easy one to maintain. But of course, we need to ensure that all the pull request review will be done properly. And then we can help out our colleagues to not send stuff out of pattern. Thanks for watching.